One of our informal mottos around here is we deliver bad news to good people because, you kind of pay more for bad news when it comes to market research than good news. If you walk off a findings presentation and all you can say is, well, it confirms what we know. That's only so exciting. So in a weird way, we get paid for delivering the bad news.
Welcome to the Marketing Expedition Podcast, an auditory journey through the latest in marketing, branding, and advertising. Now, here's your Marketing Expedition guide, Ray Allen.
On this episode of the Marketing Expedition Podcast, I get to speak with Sean Campbell. And Sean has been training, mentoring, and educating all of his life. An exceptionally well-regarded conference speaker and author, Sean has delivered talks for Fortune 50 companies and top-tier conferences. He has also been the author of several books on technical and business topics, and Sean has also been a professional services firm owner for over 20 years. He is passionate about running a remote-first company and has been doing so long before it was cool and dating back to the 20th century. His professional services has spanned consulting engagements with Fortune 50 and startups that you have heard of, and the sale of his first professional services company, and the growth of delivery, sales, marketing, and operational practices inside professional services firms. And we're going to talk about crafting effective market research for B2B companies and how to adapt to this ever-changing marketing landscape, and go into detail about some of the research tactics that are needed and necessary for marketers. So stay tuned for that, and we will be back. But first, we're going to go into our marketing essentials moments, the basics that you need for continuing to build your brand and your bottom line. Today's topic, I wanted to talk about the art of audio and how you can tell stories through audio. Previously, I talked about the video marketing necessities. Now I want to also dig into how utilizing audio can also be very valuable in your marketing strategy and plan, how radio and podcasting has exploded over the last decade, really, even longer than that. But even during the pandemic, we saw our podcast rates really skyrocket because people were listening as they're doing other things. People are multitasking, they're working out, they're commuting, they're, having their downtime and listening to podcasts a lot more. And so being able to tell your story through podcast interviews and just different things that you can do. If you think about it, when people are reading a blog post, let's say 800 words or less, or they're reading a newspaper, an actual newspaper, right? They take the paper and they actually unfold the newspaper and read it. It takes longer. And maybe even though podcasts are, on average 20 to 30 minutes in length, 40 minutes in length, the nice thing about podcasts is you can pause them and then listen to them as you need or as you can. And as you are doing things that you otherwise, maybe you're going on a walk, you can listen and multitask, but you really can't go on a walk and read a newspaper at the same time, for example, or try to read a blog post while you are going for a walk. But you can listen to a podcast or listen to at least audio that's going on. So how can you use audio storytelling in podcasting to help give more of an audience, more information that you otherwise maybe aren't getting out through blog posts or newspaper articles or magazine articles or other mediums? And of course, videos are very important too, but sometimes people aren't able to always watch, especially if they're in the car driving. At least they shouldn't be, maybe. And so how can you use the power of audio storytelling to demonstrate and share and showcase why you do what you do and how you do what you do, and describe in detail how people can engage with your brand, and your listeners will connect in an emotional way because of your storytelling and because of the ability to talk about what it is that you do, and thinking about how it's lot of people will learn in lots of different ways, right? There's the kinesthetic, there's the visual, there's the audible. And so using this as a tool, I mean, I always often listen to audiobooks. Like I'll get books, I'll get them, and they'll physically tangibly be in my hands. But sometimes listening to the book does so much more for me than me trying to read the book because I get distracted I just can't always sit and read a book, right? But I can move around and listen to a podcast. And that is just my MO. But a lot of people have that same concept of being able to listen to it or rewind it, listen to it again. I can't tell you how many times I've stopped and then paused and then rewinded something because I really wanted to, make sure I heard what was being said and how it was being said. And then thinking about how you can make an impact while people are listening to you. Oftentimes people can't write stuff down or they can't, just take a note right when they're listening. But having those show notes, having links to where they can get more information, all of that's really helpful when they can go back and get that information if they'd like, or just being able to absorb it when they need to and make marks and notes when they want to, or then when they have the ability to do so. Because again, while you're driving, you're not really supposed to be doing that. So anyway, so thinking about how you can position your information in ways that they can connect, that's convenient, that's relevant to them, that has some, I guess, ability to be where they can retell the story if they would like to, or share more information that you can then get quoted and have quotable moments for them to repeat and be able to share case and show and tell other people. That's where you can get big fans because they can tell other people about what it is that you do or how you do it or what you've said in your audio, in your podcast, or in your audio story. And then them sharing that with others is like marketing gold and genius, right? Because you want them to be able to replicate some of your story. And of course, hopefully they always give credit where credit is due. But if you can do that and have the idea that you are a thought leader and people are quoting what you had to say, that is so wonderful. And it's genuinely just a remarkable tool to be able to have that at your fingertips and have that as a capability that you can give to your audience and give to your consumers or your customers or people who are buying from you or believing in you or learning from you. Anyway, all wonderful things. And I would love to hear your feedback. Podcasts sometimes can be a one-way street unless people communicate back to me. And so I'd love to hear what you have to say about that. Maybe you've heard something on this podcast or a quotable moment that you remember having listened to this podcast before. I'd love to hear some of the feedback that you might have and just share with me what are some things that you picked up or that you learned along the way because you were listening and subscribing to this podcast. And then I'll turn around and quote you because I love that. I always give shout outs where I can. And, in my news you can use and shout outs and all that kind of good stuff and events not to miss. I do that once a month. And I always love to share when our listeners have something wonderful to say. So let me know. Or maybe it's not wonderful. Maybe you want to give me feedback and critique what I've done. That's totally fine too. Feedback is a gift and I love it and appreciate it. So reach out to us. You can do hello@themarketingexpedition.com or you can DM me on my Instagram. It's ray.allen.official. Be sure and spell my name correctly, RHEA .allen.official on Instagram, or Ray Allen, or you can find us, Peppershock Media is the company, and you can find us on all of those different places. But I would love to hear your feedback. Tell me what you think. All right, let's get into the interview. Welcome to the Marketing Expedition podcast. I'm your host, Ray Allen. I am the president and CEO of Peppershock Media and also the founder of the Marketing Expedition community. And today's guest, we have Sean Campbell on the show. Welcome to the show, Sean.
Hey, thanks for having me on.
So let's dig in and start off by just sharing more about you and how you got to where you are now.
Well, I didn't want to be a business owner. I didn't have any, it wasn't like I don't want to be a business owner. I watched business school students get up at 8 a.m. for accounting classes. And I thought, that's silly. Why would I do that? And I was a liberal arts graduate, communication bachelor's degree, actually radio television focus, history minor. Master's degree was communication, which was instructional design and political rhetoric. And always had a passion for teaching, still do.
Nice.
So I
Nice.
ended up going off, and while I was getting my master's degree, I was teaching public speaking. And then I went off and started teaching people networking, databases, programming, kind of late 90s, early aughts. Then founded my first company because I was actually an independent trainer along with two other guys. So we were kind of building a business to be independent trainers. And, I guess the net of it for me is I'm training and mentoring and educating all day. And I know some of that is because I own a services firm. So there's probably a little more of that when you own a services firm than a product firm.
Mm-hmm.
Um, I think there's a lot more to it on top of it if you own a market research firm, which I do, because there's a lot of
Mm-hmm.
educating clients about market dynamic, and where they're doing well or poorly. Like one of our informal mottos around here is we deliver bad news to good people, because you kind of pay more for bad news when it comes to market research than good news. If you walk off a findings presentation and all you can say is, well, it confirms what we know. Like, I mean, that's only so exciting. So in a weird way, we get paid for delivering the bad news. And
Mm-hmm.
on top of that, it's just kind of the way I roll. I don't really know, since I was little, how to learn something and not want to teach it. I almost think I'm like pathologically incapable of that. If I learned how to bass fish on the Willamette River by my home a few years ago, before you know it, I'm like, how can I teach more people how to do this? And, even, last thing, I guess this has been with me for a long time, because when I was in second grade, Father Boyven apparently told my mother, but I only heard years later, that, he used to refer to me as the little professor, and not because I was a smarmy little professor. I think just because he probably noticed I was always running up to him, telling him something I learned in a book, and and
Mm-hmm.
I don't think that's really ever changed. I mean, certainly some things change in people as they get older and life impacts them positively and negatively. But one thing that's never changed is I love educating, and owning a business gives me a great deal of opportunity to do that. At least the kind of business I own, and
Mm-hmm.
that's how I've been on this journey. Ultimately.
Oh, that's awesome. Well, and I read a little more into what you have authored and just some of the experiences that you've had. Let's talk a little bit about some of the companies that you've done some work for, and including some of the Fortune 50 and startup companies that you've done some work for. What's kind of a memorable moment or a memorable campaign that you've worked on that you're super proud of?
Oh, that's tough because it's been such a long time. I mean, like, you're right. My and if somebody's listening and like, oh, that sounded egocentric. I meant, like, no, literally, I'm 53 and I'm trying to remember, like, you know what I mean? It's not an ego thing. I'm like running around in the file cabinets of my brain trying to go, like, okay, what? So I don't know if I could do most memorable, or maybe that's the market researcher in me that's like, most. I don't know. I don't want to say most, but like, there's certainly lots of things where the research we did touch the product or change the company in a way, both
Mhm.
positively and negatively. I remember one project we did that literally I knew Bill Gates knew about. Like, we did this kind of research project slash kind of application build that was really cool. I know another time we got a vice president of sales fired. Felt bad about that one, but
Yeah, I
the
bet he
vice
didn't like
president
that too
is,
much.
yeah, yeah. I mean, the story there was Silicon Valley company, pretty recognizable company name, but they
Mhm.
had a UK office, and they kept shipping young. At the time we were doing the research, the phrase "bro culture," wasn't as common, let's say, but I get the
Mhm.
sense that's kind of who they were shipping over to the
Mm.
UK. And what we heard from the customers was, the minute you're not a number one product, we're never going to use you again because we hate your salespeople. We despise them. And I think this company's culture was so sales oriented, they kept seeing that as a little bit of a badge of honor, like, and
Yeah.
ultimately, the client said to me at one point, really straight clients looking at the findings deck, and this individual said, "So you're saying all our salespeople are assholes?" I said, "Yes."
Yeah.
And anyway, that deck then got translated into a slightly different version by the same person, just slightly, but there was a slide in there that literally had that sentence.
Oh,
And apparently that went all the way up to the CEO of said very large company. And then that led to the
yeah.
VP of sales getting fired. And so you can have a pretty big impact on
Yeah.
companies with research. I mean, there's a great deal of truth telling that happens with research. There's also, unfortunately, a great deal of times of people ignoring that truth. One of the
Mm-hmm.
more challenging things I think we deal with is a stakeholder team who's maybe split. Half of the people believed X before we started talking, and the other half believe Y, and we're only validating the opinions of half the room, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I remember that was one time we even just selling a project. We had a client that brought like 17 people into the call. It was literally like 17. Haven't had that many before on like it's you and someone else kind of competition to win the business. And it was
Mm.
literally 17. I still think it's strange to this day. But they brought in like 17 people to have this like, hey, vendor, explain to us why you. And at one point, after watching them scrap for a few minutes about what they thought the research should do, they say, the one guy, probably from Jersey, pops off and he says, "So why should we hire you?" And I said, "I think to stop you all from arguing. How about that to start? You know, because hopefully we can settle this argument for y'all, right?" So there's a lot of good stories like that, and I think that's one of the reasons um, I still enjoy owning a research business, after this many years,
Yeah.
because we settle arguments, we bring clarity to things. I'm sure we create some arguments too. I mean, I've watched that happen. I mean, I've watched some
Mm-hmm.
calls where I know that like they're trying to be nice in front of us, but they're all going to go wrestle in the alley after that. You know, I can see that coming sometimes as the Zoom fades to black. They should have that. They should have that as a filter. That it like fades out.
Yeah.
That'd be kind of slick. Like
Slowly fades. Yep.
we got all these dorky backgrounds, right? That like we're going to look
Yeah.
back in 20 years and they're going to be like, you used that bad of a virtual background and thought it was good. Like that was state of the art. You've pixelating in
Right.
and out of some beach. Like that was what you chose to do with your day. But yeah, yeah. So I don't know if that's what you were looking for, but I mean, there's a lot of things like that. I mean,
Yeah.
and obviously there's been those are more like corporate stories, I guess, for lack of a better phrase. But there's
Mhm.
obviously like personal things that you go through up and down on the journey too.
Yeah, for sure. And yeah, lots of different interesting things, wildly challenging things that get thrown at you, like, oh, I don't know, COVID and things like that. But why don't we dig into some types of research that you do and things that you uncover for the businesses that you get to work with? How does it work?
Well, I how does it work? It's interesting because I could answer that two ways. Like I could answer by like types of research, so there's like qualitative
Hmm.
and quantitative, and I could answer by um, you know, uh, kind of research outputs of a sort. There's buyer persona research, and there's message testing research, and there's brand studies, and there's competitive landscape research, right? And all of those things are
Hmm.
super common. But in many ways, where it starts is an understanding of whether somebody's coming to us for pain or opportunity. And I think a lot of the time it's for pain,
Hmm.
because that's going to drive ultimately the kinds of questions we need to answer. Are you under some degree of pain because you shipped a bad product, your competitor shipped a better one, you've had a poor sales effort, your competitor has a better one, you have a great marketing effort, but your competitor has even a better one, you're facing a brand new startup that's getting all the love. How do you deal with that? So that's the pain side. The opportunity side is more like, hey, I want to go launch in a new market, I've got a new AI initiative I want to push. I've got maybe a acquisition I've made. I want to launch in a new industry. But I'd say more often than not, the pain drives it. And I think there's probably a logical reason for that, because if you're facing a lot of opportunity, you can always do a little bit of math and say, well, why don't I just go see how much opportunity there is? And then when I'm struggling to get as much as I want, I can go, do some research to see how I can get more, right? There's kind of that scrappiness
Hmm.
kind of vibe that certain clients will have. On the pain side, it's so obvious that you want it removed. You really want to understand what's causing you issues. But all of that aside, I think the fundamental thing that sets grade on a research project is the audience. Like we say around here, right people, right questions a lot. And I say that the right
Mm-hmm.
people are so much a part of the project's success that it even overshadows almost everything else, like methodology and the like. Because
Mm-hmm.
ultimately, if you're not talking to the right people, as simplistic as it is, you, it doesn't really matter what the research methodology is. It doesn't matter how good your line of questioning is. And that can get
Mm-hmm.
very specific in B2B. There can be a lot of different attributes of somebody, audience somebody wants to talk to. And that's frankly probably where we spend a lot of our conversations. I mean, there's plenty of
Mm-hmm.
conversations as the project progresses about what are good recommendations and what are good insights and what are we learning. But in the very, very beginning, we probably spend the greatest amount of time really trying to understand, like, who do you want to talk to? And is
Mm-hmm.
that even feasible, right? Because just because you want us to recruit, a unicorn type customer, it doesn't necessarily mean that we can do that, 10 or 20 of those to fill out a complete study. So there's even some horse trading that goes on there too.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, getting somebody close to what you're after. And yeah, I think you're right by identifying exactly what it is that you want first to even then be able to get the types of people to study. That takes some work in and of itself, right?
Oh yeah, I mean that's a massive part of the effort. I mean, it's the equivalent of engines on a plane. I try not to use Boeing
Mm-hmm.
analogies too much these days, but I did anyway. It's the gas in the engine. It's all of that, right?
Right.
And so yeah, without effective recruiting, it's really really hard. And the research industry is kind of interesting that way because it is a little bit like aircraft engines and airframes, right? Boeing doesn't make engines. Maybe
Mm-hmm.
thank God, right now, but it'd be a whole nother thing to go wrong on the plane. But they're essential, right? You don't really have a plane without the engines, but that's made by a completely different line of suppliers. And in the market research industry, the recruiting is almost inevitably done by a different organization than the market research firm. Recruiting firms are
Mm-hmm.
basically have been separated off for years as kind of a supplier of sorts of recruits. And
Mm-hmm.
there's some very good reasons for that, actually. But it does create kind of a challenge because you really have to figure out who are you going to have for good partners, and
Mm-hmm.
that's fundamental to turning it into really excellent research.
Yeah, I mean, being able to find people, first of all, that would fit the mold of who you want to recruit to do the research with, but then also get convincing them that the time is worthwhile, right? I mean, do you find that it's hard to get people to commit to doing, if it's surveys or focus groups or whatever you want them to do? People are always so busy all the time. Do you think that that's a challenge now too?
It depends on which one of those ones we're talking about. I think
Mhm.
surveys, because there's a degree of impersonalness to that. I think
Mhm.
that's always been a greater challenge, right? You fundamentally don't feel when you get a survey invite, no matter how that email's written, that you personally have been selected. You know,
Mm.
it,
Mhm.
people make attempts, but it's challenging because it is a little bit sterile, right?
Yeah.
I think on the qualitative side, though, you can do a great amount of work because it's also a smaller scale. For you to recruit, for example, like an N of 100 study, which isn't a very large quantitative study at all, you
Mhm.
might have to have upwards of 2,000 people that you hit with an email because your response rate might only be down in the single digit percentages.
Right.
Whereas, for qualitative research, it's very, very common for like an audience, like a particular singular audience you're looking at, to maybe only do 10 interviews, 15 interviews, right?
Mhm.
Um, and your response rate's usually actually a little higher, partly because you can usually be much more specific about that individual because you only need so many respondents. And
Mhm.
you also are looking at probably attributes that, are a little more particular, at times.
Mhm.
And so your outreach can be very particular. It's kind of like sales outreach in that way, right? If you're targeting only 10 accounts, you can be extremely specific in the kind of prospecting language you're going to use. On the other hand, if you're trying to target small business owners for e-signature solutions, right, probably have pretty broad language because you're not targeting for the type of business you're targeting, right? You're just
Mhm.
saying, do you need e-signature? Hopefully better than that. But,
Right.
that's basically what you're pitching. So that's a big piece of it. So yes, it's hard to get recruits in any season. Quantitative's more difficult because of scale and some of the dynamics of quantitative. Qualitative's
Hmm.
those weird though. Like sometimes it can move quicker than you think, partly because you are targeting a niche audience for their expertise, and it ties into something my mother-in-law used to ask, still asks occasionally, not as much as she used to. It's the classic. My in-laws are great. I absolutely love my in-laws, which is
I'm
a
glad
rare
you
thing to
put.
say, but
I'm
I
glad
but
you
I
said
but I
that.
do. Uh, I feel very blessed by my in-laws, but very the kind of question your in-laws ask, like, are you going to make a good enough living kind of question. When I started a market research business, they one or both of them said to me, "So why do people talk to you?" Like kind of like I wouldn't talk to you. I mean, you're my son-in-law, but I wouldn't talk to you. And I said back to him something that I've said for years. If you tell someone that they're smart and you mean it, and you ask them to talk to you about what you just said they're smart about, almost everyone on this planet will give you a portion of their day.
Hmm. There you go.
It's a fact. I mean, we could do this now. Like if somebody's listening and they're like, okay, go find somebody that I think is really smart. Like fishing's my hobby. I already gave that one away, one of my hobbies.
Yeah.
And I want to go learn a lot about fishing on the river nearest my home, the Willamette. And I walk up to some guy at church or wherever and I say, hey, I heard you fish on the Willamette for bass. I like to fish for bass. Sounds like you know a lot. Can you talk to me for a few minutes? What are the percentage of people that just turn on their heel and say, nah? Like it's
Right.
pretty low, right? I mean, you might get, could you talk to me tomorrow? You might get like, I could talk 5 minutes now or more later, but there's just this human dynamic that comes into play. And so why I'm tying that into qualitative is in qualitative research, you can be pretty narrow like that. You can be like, hey, I
Mm.
saw your LinkedIn profile. You're an amazing data scientist on Gen AI initiatives. And it looks like you do a lot on how that impacts HR role in organizations. I'd love to. Okay, well, that's not a generalizable outreach at that point,
Hmm.
right? That's pretty specific. And a decent percentage of the people you reach out to are going to do that.
Yeah.
And so that to me, it's all about. And you could say that is pretty much the exact same thing you would say to a sales team or a marketing team.
Yeah. Well, and to your point of people love to talk about the things that they know and about themselves. So if you phrase it right and craft the message to get them to talking, then that's half the battle.
Right. Like yeah, I think Dale Carnegie was the guy who said this. I might be misattributing it, but I think he said you know, the most important word that anyone loves to hear is their own name. Now, Dale
Yeah.
Carnegie used to use it in sales to be like, now, John. Now, it became
Yeah.
such a meme that now, depending on how you hear it, it actually might be a negative, in terms of how it's being used. But
Right.
but it's still true, right? Nobody wants to get in a marketing email message that says F name colon, you know, on the front.
Hmm.
I mean,
Yeah.
you want to see your name there, right?
Hmm.
It was auto populated, but it better be there. So I think it's just that degree of hyper personalization we can get to these days that
Yeah.
you can leverage at qual, but it's just super hard with quant because you just have to hit so many people to fill out a quantitative survey. And the other thing I'd say about quantitative that's tough in B2B research is that, and this is probably more opinion than I would say it's like a stone cold fact, but
Hmm.
normally we're investigating things that have lots of different permutations, right? It is not um in our house we quote the line in Wall-E that's like blue is the new red or red is the new blue. If anybody remembers that from that movie, there's a clip in that movie where they
Wally.
do that. And we're not doing research on whether the iPhone should be rose gold or not. I'm fully aware that consumer research can be incredibly detailed, depending on the space you're looking at, and incredibly
Hmm.
interesting. But there's a lot of consumer research that's kind of like just broad-based preference stuff. Do you
Hmm.
like the ketchup bottle turned upside down? Well, it turned out a lot of people like the ketchup bottle turned upside down, and all our ketchup bottles are turned upside down. You know,
Yeah.
so you can, there's things that can be really powerful, but those are not I don't think that was a 60-minute conversation about which way they wanted the ketchup bottle turned. You know, I just can't imagine it. Okay. But you can have a 60-minute conversation about like, how are you going to secure your company's data in a world of, prolific AI agents that, like these are meaty conversations. And what I mean by that is sometimes that's hard to distill into a set of somewhat sterile web-based questions in a survey, right?
Mm-hmm.
No matter how well you craft those questions, it's not the same as listening to someone's voice and going, I think I should follow up.
Right.
Right.
Well, and there's differences between being able to have where you can, attach numbers to a response versus having a story told and the
Well,
different
and
kind of information you're going to get, right?
yeah, and that's honestly one of our biggest challenges, frankly, is that some clients, it's just happened just before I got on the interview with you.
Mm.
There was a client where we did a qualitative research study. We talked to some of their lost customers. We talked to competitor customers, and it wasn't a massive study. This was a smaller company, so we did maybe like 20 interviews or whatever. And we're going through the findings deck, and this individual on the client side says, hey, for all the bullets in this deck, like literally for all the bullets, can you put an N next to each one of how many people said that? And I chimed in and I said, I understand the ask. Like, I really, really do. I know you want to measure it quantitatively, but this is qualitative research. It's by direction. It's directional. By definition, it's directional.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's when we use words like many or some or whatever. And the individual's like, but I really want to know the number, and it's like,
Yeah.
and we run into that a fair amount, right? Because the problem is, though, you can also run a quantitative survey, and so that would be an argument for quant, which is legitimate. But the problem
Mm-hmm.
with quantitative is very often you don't know the why. Like, they're filling a lot of check boxes out. Yeah, I hate your product. I hate your product. I like the other guys. I like the other guys. I'm massively oversimplifying here, right?
Right.
The
Yeah.
price is high. The price is low. I don't have a need for any of this. No, I don't like that message. Right. And the
But
in between
why? But
stuff,
why?
yeah, yeah. And
Yeah.
the in between stuff where you put in a lot of, big matrix questions. So you see all the possibilities and weighting and ranking and, or you put a lot of open ends in a survey or whatever. I mean, there are techniques to gather more than like choose A, B, C, D, or none of the above. But the problem with those is those are really taxing time wise on the person. And
Mm-hmm.
and that goes back to the fact that people will only spend so much time with a survey. I mean, there is no such animal as a 60-minute web survey that somebody takes. But there is a 60-minute
Yeah.
interview that happens all the time in the market research industry. Right?
Yeah.
And so you have to balance these two out, and we deal with it all the time. Like, we get somebody on the phone and they're like, but I want a number. And I'm like, I understand you want a number, but that may not be the right thing for you. Like, you
Mm-hmm.
might actually get a lot more out of a directional study. And for the record, we do a lot of quant and qual around here. So
Mm-hmm.
we ended up just kind of by the questioning and the dialogue, like, just conversations flow naturally. Somebody listening might be thinking like, gosh, this guy hates quant. I don't hate quant. I just, in
Mm-hmm.
the line of work that I'm in B2B market research, it has some challenges that are just more difficult to navigate than if I was like a B2C oriented firm. If I surveyed, millennials, Gen Alpha, all day long, you know, um, the example I used in one meeting the other day was like, I was saying something similar, and I said, like, let's say a survey on Gen Alpha when they go to the mall, and I was like, that's a dumb example. Gen Alpha doesn't even know where a mall is, but like, they wouldn't even know one existed actually
Right.
ever. There's just this
They just
brown
order
building
online
right. There's this brown
on
building they
social media.
drive by, or these the Instagram memes they see about it. You know
Yeah.
what I mean? Malls, they existed at one point. So, there's total utility to it. It's very, very different with B2B when it comes to quant. So anyway.
Mm-hmm. No, that makes a lot of sense. Hello, this is Ray Allen, President and CEO of Peppershock Media, and your host of the Marketing Expedition podcast. And I'm here to invite you to one of my favorite events, New Marketing Trends for the New Year workshop. There will be an amazing lineup of speakers, and if you're interested in being recognized as one of our sponsors, email us at info@peppershock.com or give us a call at 208-461-5070. And I'll be there to share all the latest and greatest in marketing tips, tactics, tricks, and new technologies that you need to know about in the new year. We'll break it down, mix it up, and take you from I totally just can't even to yes, we can. We'll help you build your brand and your bottom line. Bring your team, bring your boss, bring a friend. Let's get ready to kickstart the new year by attending the New Marketing Trends for the New Year workshop. Get your tickets now. Go to marketingtrendsevent.com. So how would you recommend then a B2B company who is thinking about doing some effective marketing research? What advice would you give them? What would you tell them to consider? And, kind of the why they should do it, but also how they would go about doing it.
Well, first I would ask whether you need research at all, because sometimes, and this probably feels heretical, in a way to the market research industry, but the reality is your gut may be enough. I'm a small business owner of a team of a dozen or so. I can't afford market research on every question that I have.
Right.
Right?
Wouldn't that be nice?
I mean, it'd be nice if I could, right? But, so there's that first question, where do I really need to spend the money? Where do I have the greatest degree of ambiguity? And if I move away that ambiguity, what's my greatest return? The second thing is definitely, who do I want to talk to? Because the market research firm you talk to, anyone that's good, is going to spend a lot of time asking you who to talk to. And I would say, to be kind to your research firm, recognize that there will be limits as to how deeply they can recruit, as there are in anything. For example, you go into a restaurant, you can order it medium rare, medium well. You can't order the steak half 145 degrees and the other half 185 degrees. I mean, maybe you can somewhere, but I've never seen it, right? Like, there are limits. And let's actually take that analogy one step further. You could, right? There could be a restaurant that literally grills the steak separately, but the mechanisms to do that would be more complicated to an inordinate degree, meaning your steak is probably really expensive, right?
Yeah.
And so there's a lot of that to think about. Like, what are those audiences? Because that will compose. So that's actually the piece of homework I give clients. I did that just the other day on a call. Client called us up and said, I want to do this brand study, but it also wants to impact our messaging once we understand things about our brand. And we've got all these audiences, and they listed out like blurb. There was like 92 audiences they wanted to talk to. And I said,
wow.
Okay, it wasn't quite that bad, but it was almost that bad. And I said, like, look, if you think about these as like puzzle pieces, right? Or it's like a multidimensional cube, right? You've got all these different audience characteristics, company size, industry, title, just to take some of the more straightforward ones. I want you to look at that as like something like a multi-dimensional spreadsheet of sorts, and kind of say, all right, where do things light up? What intersections do I care the most to learn about? Because we're going to come back to you and say, for each one of those intersections, there's an appropriate number of interviews or survey respondents that allow us to have confidence that we've actually learned something meaningful, not just like an anecdote from a interview. And that's going to basically drive the cost of your project a lot. We're going to add those puzzle pieces up. And then, there's obviously other elements, like if we're doing like strategy work on top of that or whatever. But, those are the building blocks. So that's a big thing. I would definitely come to the meeting with an understanding of the whole qualitative, quantitative divide, have meaningful conversations, like with your stakeholders, perhaps, or if you are the stakeholder, have them with yourself, right? Like, do I want numbers? Like, am I just not going to be comfortable without numbers? And then go into the meeting and talk to that market research vendor and say, like, I just really want numbers. You can talk me out of wanting numbers, but I really want numbers. Or you're like, we've had all the numbers in the world. We just need a lot of discovery. Like, I want to sit down. Another thing would be, ask yourself how much you want to participate, right? I think that's a really critical thing when hiring almost any services firm, especially anyone that's doing anything complicated, right? Technically, they should be able to do the job with minimal intervention from you, right? If they know what they're doing. On the other hand, research is a process of like constant discovery through the whole project, right? So if you can leave yourself time to actually be involved, right? It's
Mhm.
not like hiring a web development firm, for example, right? And this is not knocking web development firms. Like, I mean,
Right.
we've hired them over the years. Technically, you talk to them, they understand what you want, they come back with some wireframes, then they come back with some visuals, then they go deploy. There's these natural points where you should give context, right? You shouldn't be like watching them actually build the wireframe, right? You shouldn't
Right.
be like sitting selecting the images with them, right? That's an illogical use of time, right?
Mhm.
But research is a little different. Like we actually ask folks to listen in if they have time, anonymously and kind of confidentially, uh,
Mhm.
into the actual interviews we're conducting. Because if they can listen to them live or listen to recordings, they might halfway through the project go, "I had no idea that was happening. Can you guys ask
Mhm.
this instead?" Right?
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
we're trying to look for those pivots too. But fundamentally, our clients are the ones that operate in their business, right?
Mhm.
So as much as we can have a good partnership there would be good. Um, and the last thing I'd say is, it, it's well, there's probably a couple other things. I would say two fast things. I mean, one, recognize you got to be tall enough to ride the ride. I mean, not to be like a downer about it, but like, real research costs something because you have to, at a minimum, at least pay the people that are participating in the research, right?
Mhm.
We sometimes have
Mhm.
people come to us and they're like, well, what do you mean you can't do that for that? And I'm like, look, there's like an element here that we don't even control, right? Like I have to get great research participants, and that's going to come at a cost by itself, right? Like,
Right.
and so there's like this floor, I guess is what I'm saying. We have startups come to us on and off, and they'll be like, well, I want to do a brand study, and I've got 5K. And I'm like, okay, you're not tall enough to ride the ride. Like, you know, and that can be really hard though when you are that startup and you're like, but I want to know, right? And there's
Mhm.
some self-service research options you can do. There's things like that. That would be a different topic, I guess. I'm happy to talk about it.
Mhm.
But and the other thing, last thing I would say is, you know, and I'm going to steal a line of somebody that I actually interviewed for a project that I was doing for us recently on Gen AI. I talked to a
Mhm.
guy who is doing Gen AI work in finance, and I was talking to the guy about this ever shifting sand we have now of AI tools taking over portions of jobs, right? And
Mhm.
anyway, the net of it was he says to me, "Well, right, you can't hug your job." And I said, "What?" And he said, "Well, you can't hug your job. Like ultimately it's going to change. Like you're going to have to build on top of it." And I gave him this line I heard from a guy, Ethan Mollick. I think it's Ethan Mollick, who said to students in education, he tells his students Gen AI use is an F. And he doesn't mean using it as an F. He means it's the baseline. Everybody can go ask ChatGPT that question. So you have to build on top of that. And so where I'm going with this is that look for a firm who's actually really using AI um, to accelerate their operations, because I think if you're working with somebody who's not, you're paying the price for them not adopting.
Mhm.
And I think you can make that argument honestly about almost anything you buy now that's a business service, right? If you go to the marketing firm and they're like, bah, humbug, Scrooge, I've always loved the Star Trek Picard captain version of it. You know what I mean? But like, I mean, if he's like sitting there like, Christmas, I'm never going to use AI, I would run. I would go find the company that's using it, because you're just paying for them to be a laggard, right? That's
Mhm.
what you're doing right now. I mean, these tools have reached a point where they can be trusted to perform certain business actions. And that's empirical if you just look on the internet and see who's using them. And so,
Mhm.
very risk adverse companies are fairly invested in Gen AI right now. And I'm sure there's a small voice of somebody out there going, but see, it'll all go wrong for them. And I'm like, I know, but you're the guy who owns there's an example. There's a little town called Malala just south of us, and I love Malala. That's where our church is at. It's a great little town, but it has a saddle shop in it, and God bless that guy. It'd be pretty cool to own a saddle shop actually in this day and age. But I think Malala probably had 100 saddle shops circa 1905. So there's always going to be one marketing agency that will be the saddle shop of the future, right? And they might do a great job, right? That's fine. Like we write our own stuff. We've never ever touched AI. And so, but I would just, in this day and age, if they don't have a big AI sticker on the front door, I think you're just paying for their inability to get on the bandwagon and you're going to end up with a worse result. So,
Yeah. Well, I think that there's a lot to be said about doing the research to begin with and not just going blindly and hoping and praying that your campaign's going to work and that you're not just wasting your money and and making sure that what you're wanting to accomplish can get accomplished by what you're doing. So I also teach a marketing class at Boise State here and also the National Student Advertising Competition class for the American Ad Fed.
oh, very cool.
And so a lot of discussion comes up about research, of course. And so they do primary, they do secondary, they do a variety of different things. And usually it's pretty accelerated in a very short time frame. But what kind of advice would you give to students who are learning how to research how best to get the information that they need in a pretty rapid kind of way, but also, getting valuable information in this kind of evolving, changing marketing industry that we're in? What kind of advice would you give to students who are approaching the idea of doing research?
Get really good with LinkedIn. Get
Mm-hmm.
really smart about how you send email outreach via LinkedIn and pick
Mm-hmm.
up the phone. For the love of God, pick up the phone.
Pick up the phone, yes.
Pick up the phone. I mean, I remember, and I didn't do this to humble the students. And they understood I wasn't doing for it. And they understood I was trying to help them. Like this, if you didn't know that when you hear the story, if somebody's listening, they might be like, But I'm going to go back to being an adjunct in the fall. I'm really excited about it. I stopped because
Good.
my kids were growing and I started when they were young and I was an adjunct in an MBA program. And I'm going back to be an adjunct in a business school. Anyway, and so in the first stint of that, I was teaching an industry analysis class and I was also teaching a competitive intelligence class. And at one point, the students were trying to like analyze a market for this thing that they wanted to build for their startup. They had this idea of a startup for, I think, a different class on entrepreneurship they were taking. And they wanted to like,
Mm-hmm.
study the industry around it for my class. And I was like, that's fine. Like it made sense.
Yeah.
And at one point they were like talking a lot about whether the thing they were trying to make, which had something to do with, it was something about like a baby carrier or something for men. I honestly, I have the vaguest memory of what the thing was, but anyway, and I said, well, have you called like the maternity section of like Macy's or, you know what I mean? Like whatever, like call a department store to see
Mm-hmm.
if the person who sells the stuff in that department would think the thing you're offering is something that anybody's ever asked for or whatever. Like and people shouldn't get too locked on what they were building because I can't quite remember what it was,
Yeah.
but it was like, I was like, in other words, have you talked to people who sell the thing to the audiences that
Mm-hmm.
you try to sell to? Right.
Right.
And they
Right.
were like, no. And they were kind of like, I don't know how to do that. And I'm like, I just said Macy's. It's like
Pick up the
8:30 at
phone.
night. And I'm sitting in
Yeah.
class with them and class is at 9. I said, you mind if I call somebody for you? And they were like, who? I said, Macy's. So like I just picked up the phone and I just called Macy's or whatever department store it was. And we had like a 20-minute conversation with the sales rep, right? That was standing in the department store. And I just kind of looked at him when the phone went down and I'm like, yeah, like more of that. like do more of that. I think that's the biggest hang up, right? And that's even true for young entrepreneurs, right? I mean, just talk to people. It's called research. Like you can literally just do that. I mean, I remember students would kind of lock up and they wouldn't go do that. And interestingly enough, one of the students that actually didn't lock up and did a bunch of good recruit and did a bunch of her own interviews. Well, she still works here at Cascade. I hired her. So like 11 years now or so later, she's still here.
Aw.
You know, it's kind of cute. Yeah. So she's the longest standing employee we have. So yeah. So net, that would be my advice is I think they just lock up. It's kind of like thinking about sales is not the same thing as doing sales, right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Like you see that dynamic in sales, like where they lock up and they say like, well, I need to plan my prospecting again. I need to, arrange my opportunities a little more. No, 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 no. It's sales is kinetic. And I think market research is kinetic. Like
Mm-hmm.
you need to be talking to the market. I think the
Right.
hardest problem probably, and you could comment on this from your perspective, I think is if a student's trying to do a quantitative survey with a business audience, that's hard,
Mm-hmm.
you know, because you got to, are you tall enough to ride the ride financially? Do you have a meaningful population of people to hit? If you're using a source that's really cheap, I could probably tell you that it's probably not that great. You might have professional survey takers in there. You might not have the people in there who you think they are.
Mm-hmm.
All the survey traps in the world might not prevent that from happening. You know,
Right.
People are pretty savvy these days. They use ChatGPT to fill out open ends. Uh,
Mm-hmm.
there's just a lot of things that are hard if you want to get quantitative data. But then the flip side of that is there's so much open source intelligence data, right? That
Mm-hmm.
you can get, in many cases, you can get some kind of quantitative data, albeit secondhand, right?
Mm-hmm.
To marry up with some qualitative that, again, if it's, and I mean this, hopefully in the right way, if it's just a student project, right? I mean, you're not out of school yet. And if you're doing it to kind of like illustrate a point or show how to do research effectively or buttress the argument for the campaign you're building or the advertising effort, um, there's a lot there. And the last thing I'd say is, and this is a little bit in a different direction, but there's the whole concept of like synthetic respondents with AI that's really
Mm-hmm.
powerful. You can go create a synthetic version in an AI, like act as if you're this customer with these kinds of needs in this kind of environment, and you can interact. And I mean, people do this very regularly now. We've even created synthetics based off data that we have. Um, it's a very, very powerful methodology. It has its concerns and it has its faults, but I think it
Mm-hmm.
does one thing that is really powerful is it basically lets you kind of chat with the findings in a way. And that's really, really significant. So anyway, so I don't know if that's too many things, but that's the stuff I would tell somebody. The only thing I'd steer away from is this, the student, and maybe you found a different way around it, but my impression would be is if they're trying to target a B2B audience with whatever they're
Mm-hmm.
researching, and they're like, I'm going to go run an N of 200 quant survey, I'd probably go a different route.
Yeah. Find other
So,
ways, other means.
yep.
It's fascinating all the different things that you can do now to understand behavioral, reactions and like the technology of where you can I saw one group that submitted for the competition. They used where they could it's almost like a lie detector test where they like hooked up wires to people and did like facial recognition and like reactions, and they had people watch commercials that they had produced and got the reactions of their faces of the people that they were testing. And it was really interesting to see kind of the tools that they used from nonverbal communication, like the body language and like the heart rates and this crazy stuff. And I was like, oh my gosh, this is so fascinating.
Oh no, there's a ton of that. It hasn't made its
Hmm.
way as deeply into B2B, but
Hmm.
and part of that has a little bit to do with the dynamic of the interview process itself. I mean, there's still a decent number of B2B interviews, even in our line of work, where somebody like dials in via their phone into Zoom or whatever, because you're talking to business professionals during their day, right?
Yeah.
A lot, and there's just you could draw obvious extrapolations as to why like they're not just going to go sit at their desk and take a Zoom call and go get paid 200
Mhm.
bucks. You know what I mean? It's like, what are you doing there,
Yeah.
Bob? Well,
Yeah.
making money while we're paying you. Yes, that's what I'm
Yep.
doing. Making money while you're paying me, right? Um, so And to be clear, I would hope everyone's using some degree of flex time or whatever. And we do more calls that, seemingly appear in the lunch hour for whoever we're talking to, or earlier in their
Mm-hmm.
day or later in the day. But even so,
That's good.
um, so you don't have everybody like sitting at a desk in the same clear way. But even so, I think we're going to see a lot more of that.
Mm-hmm.
Things that we used to think are creepy are no longer creepy. I mean, how many things could put into that category is an odd thing to say, right?
Right.
The way technology kind of monitors us and supports us, and
Mm-hmm.
monitors us and helps us, right? And you see the same dynamic with AI. I'm never putting anything in an AI. It's going to go in the data set. Well, they used to say the same thing about Gmail. They were afraid that it was going to service ads. Last time I checked, nobody's really worried about using Gmail. So,
Mm-hmm.
and I think you'll see the same thing. You might find Zoom and a lot of the other conference platforms have the kinds of things you're mentioning, semi-native or ability to turn on. I could totally see understand your team is engaged with our emotional sensor apparatus, blah, blah. I mean, it's probably going to happen. I bet it's on their drawing board. They're just too frightened to release it, kind of thing. But there's a whole host of things that I think we're going to see around that line, because you even see it in sales platforms these days. Gong,
Mm-hmm.
Chorus, they do a ton of stuff around analyzing conversational patterns, who spoke more, who spoke less, what were the phrases that generated interest, and that's in the same rough bucket, right? Of
Mm-hmm.
analyzing kind of, when the conversation turned into something meaningful, right? So
Yeah.
yeah, lots to come there. Lots and lots and lots to come.
That's awesome. Well, Sean, I know that you have authored some books. Do you want to share what those are and how people can reach you and your books?
Yeah, well, the books are a little older. I don't know if I'll just say that I'm happy that I've written books. The tone of that makes it sound like I might not write another one again for a while. Like, I mean, no, it's an arduous process to do a book, and things move
Mm-hmm.
so fast these days. I'm a little, never say never, but I did do a couple books. I did a few for Microsoft Press, did one for Intel Press, did another book that got to like its 6th edition. I used to give a ton of conference talks on that, on open source intelligence. And
Nice.
yeah. So no, it was fun to go do that. But most of my efforts now are around teaching. That's partly why I signed up
Mm-hmm.
to kind of go be an adjunct again and things like that. But as far as reaching out to me, just Sean, SEAN at cascadeinsights.com. Or if folks don't remember that, just go to cascadeinsights.com and fill out the contact form. We're only a team of 12. I'm sure somebody will be able to figure out that they need to go shove that email my way. You
Right.
can just do it that way too.
Very cool. And you're on LinkedIn as well. I'm on your
Yep.
LinkedIn page and
Yep.
connecting. So I sent you a connection request. Anyway, thank you for sharing all of this. I mean, I always just stress how important it is for people to do the research, because sometimes people try to skip out on doing that part of any campaign that they run, and I think that it's so important to have that information to be able to then make wise decisions and not just assumptions, right? And so I think what you're doing is awesome, and more people need to do more of it.
Well, I appreciate that. Yeah, I 100%. There's no reason not to fly with a bit of clarity, right? And that's what we
Yeah,
believe too.
for sure. I like that. And for those of you listening, the best thing that you can do for Sean and I both is to share this episode with those that you know that need to learn more about doing research, the importance of research. And thanks again, Sean, for joining us today.
Yeah, thanks for having me on. I really, really appreciate it. Thanks you for the chat.
And until next time, everybody, enjoy your marketing journey.
Thanks for listening to the Marketing Expedition podcast. Want to continue the journey? Don't miss out on new episodes. Subscribe on iTunes, Spotify, Amazon Music, or wherever you get your podcasts. Wouldn't it be great if there was one place you can go to get all the latest information and tips about marketing and advertising? The Marketing Expedition community is that place. People like you gather in our online community to build relationships with others and find the latest marketing trends, tactics, tools, and technology. We help you build your brand and your bottom line. Start your adventure today. Visit themarketingexpedition.com to find out more.